Welcome to the deep dive. Today we are plunging into, well, one of the most fundamental conflicts shaping the 21st century, really. It's this tension between the age of, individual freedom, self-actualization, autonomy, and the critical necessity of we, that's social cohesion, collective responsibility, cooperation.
Right, and this is a deep dive where we're synthesizing quite a range of sources. We're looking at everything from, say, 17th century political philosophy, John Locke, Kenneth Minogue's historical analysis of individualism, right through to contemporary cross-cultural psychology. We've got studies examining well-being in Japan versus the U.S., sociological critiques of hyper-individualism in our digital age, and even some fascinating experimental data on economic cooperation from public goods games. So, a broad sweep.
Yeah, quite the stack. And our mission here is to move way beyond just saying individualism is good or bad. We really need to understand its profound impact, which is often, well, paradoxical, isn't it? Has the celebration of the individual, which, let's face it, paved the way for modern freedom and huge prosperity, especially in the West, has it now surged so much that it's actually threatening the very social stability it needs? Is it breeding isolation, undermining our ability to act together on big global issues like climate change or, pandemics?
That paradox is exactly it. Prosperity and isolation sort of existing side by side. That's the core tension we need to unpack across all these different fields.
Okay, let's get into it then. Let's trace the roots of this revolution in self-identity.
All right, so first off, we have to make a really crucial distinction. Individuality, everyone being unique, that's universal.
Yeah.
But individualism is something much more specific. It's actually a distinct moral practice that emerged historically, particularly in European cultures. It's this moral recognition that the wants, the beliefs, the aspirations of an individual are valuable in themselves.
That sounds almost obvious today, but thinking historically, that's a revolutionary idea, right? We're talking about moving away from societies where your worth was completely tied to your inherited status, your family, your fixed role in a very custom-bound community.
Absolutely. Minogue details this as this huge intellectual revolution kicking off around the 15th, 16th centuries. Before that shift, challenging established customs or doctrines. That was often seen as disruptive, maybe even, heretical. But in Europe, that challenge started to be framed differently. Not as an attack on the system, but as an act of valuable discovery.
And this required breaking down what Minogue calls the solid realities of those traditional societies. What were those exactly, and how did individualism dissolve them?
Yeah, the solid realities. Those were the sort of objective, fixed moral and social orders. Things like God-ordained hierarchy, the unchanging truth of the church, the certainty of custom, inherited law. Individualism challenged these by dissolving them into two new components, the subjective and the objective. The objective might be the physical world, observable facts, but the subjective component, that's the individual's feeling, their conscience, their judgment, that gained immense new weight.
Okay, so if the external world isn't totally dictated by custom anymore, the individual now has the freedom, the autonomy, to build a world they find, well, more agreeable. But that raises a political question, doesn't it? If the individual is now the source of value, what gives the state its authority?
And that brings us straight to John Locke. His philosophy really provides the political cornerstone for individualism. His fundamental premise was, frankly, radical for the time. Men are naturally free and equal. They exist in a state of nature, he said, where they possess these inherent rights, specifically life, liberty, and property. And these rights exist before and are independent of any government law.
That's a massive break from earlier political thought where rights usually came from the king or, God. Locke's rights are just intrinsic.
They are. And crucially, his definition of property rights wasn't just about land. It was an extension of the individual's own labor, what they'd miffed their own efforts into. This meant, basically, you owned yourself in your labor. So a legitimate government doesn't grant these rights. It only comes into being through the consent of the people, specifically to protect those pre-existing rights.
But hang on, if the Lockean individual is naturally free and has these rights, why would they ever agree to give up any power to a state? Isn't that consent the first little crack in pure individualism?
It is. You could say that, but it's framed as a strategic conditional transfer. Individuals consent to leave that state of nature, where their rights are always vulnerable, and set up a civil government whose only job is to better ensure they can stably enjoy those individual rights. And if the government breaks that contract, Locke gave the philosophical justification for the right of revolution. That's profound. The idea that individuals could withdraw consent and overthrow a tyrannical state that really elevated individual agency to the highest political level back in the 17th century.
It's pretty extraordinary to think that this intellectual framework, which actually encouraged conflict because suddenly everyone's opinion mattered, simultaneously kicked off Europe's path toward, remarkable freedom, tolerance, and incredible prosperity.
And this brings us back to the moral complexity side. Individualism isn't just about demanding rights. It's also deeply tied to honor and self-definition. Montesquieu saw this when he was categorizing political systems. He argued modern monarchies weren't just based on virtue, like a republic, or fear, like despotism, but on honor, this recognition of the individual's worth and their reputation.
So, in this framework, the individualist isn't just concerned with whether an act is right or wrong in outcome, but what that act says about their own character. They're constantly sort of building their reputation.
Precisely. Minogue gives that really powerful anecdote about the Viscount of Orte. After the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre, Charles IX ordered him to kill Huguenots. Orte refused. He declared his army didn't consist of executioners. Now, obedience was the custom, the expectation. But his refusal, that was the individualist moral act. It was centered on preserving his personal honor, his character, even against the king's authority. It put self-definition above that social obligation.
Okay, so that transition from moral self-definition to the, the powerful machinery of the modern economy, that's the next crucial step. And this is where it gets really interesting for me. How did this philosophical focus on the individual turn into an economic driver? How did self-interest, which historically was seen as, a major vice, get rebranded as a necessary virtue for society?
Well, this is the genius of Adam Smith. He provided the framework that managed to reconcile individual ambition with the public good. Smith's observation was simple but revolutionary. He saw that when individuals pursue their own self-interested, goal-seeking profit, inventing better ways to make things, trying to secure their own material future, they often, quite unintentionally, end up supporting the public good through what he called an invisible hand.
So he effectively carved out this third independent sphere, didn't he? Alongside the state and society, we now recognize it as the economy. And this sphere operates on production, consumption, competition.
The profound implication there is that we don't actually need a central authority or some benevolent leader telling everyone what's best for the collective. Instead, we rely on the specialized knowledge and the self-judgment of the individual. Smith famously questioned the usefulness of people who claim to trade for the public good. He basically believed the individual is the best, the most infallible judge of their own interests. And this insight validated ambition, self-reliance, and drove unprecedented material success.
Yet even as these commercial societies were generating massive wealth and more individual freedom, that sort of shadow image of selfishness just wouldn't go away. Why didn't the prosperity erase the moral anxiety?
Because that individualist economic drive bumps up against really deeply held moral traditions. Christians worried about, the idolatry of mammon-worshipping wealth, collectivist traditionalists. They pointed to the inevitable problems freedom brought: alienation, social divides, the breakdown of old community bonds. This lingering moral discomfort meant that commercial societies were kind of perpetually framed by some as inherently selfish, no matter how much the overall quality of life actually improved.
And that enduring tension, this need to justify self-interest, that leads us straight into the modern consumer economy. How is that philosophical idea of the autonomous size packaged up and sold to us today?
Well, the modern economy doesn't just tolerate individualism. It actively brands it.
Yeah.
It sells it as an essential virtue. We see this so clearly in marketing strategies, where companies deliberately align their whole identity with the consumer's desire for self-celebration.
Right, like that case study of Midway. They entered the incredibly crowded financial services sector back in 2008. They couldn't just compete on price. They had to compete on identity, didn't they?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Their core concept, me way, it was the logical outcome of this intense focus on the individual. Their entire strategy was built on recognizing what they called a growing collective consciousness that celebrates people as individuals. They weren't just selling insurance. They were selling validation of the self.
And they used specific brand things to push this message. Like they had that bold, modern, almost quirky art style centered around that bright cerise pink color. It signaled something edgy, unique, completely the opposite of the old, stuffy financial institutions.
And the messaging was so direct. Slogans like, "The only insurance company that rewards you for being you." That's pure Lockean individualism filtered through a marketing lens. The implication is, your way is right, and we're the only ones who recognize and actually pay you for your personal identity, your choices.
Even their communication strategy was framed around the individual. They launched that online complaints and compliments section. They said it was the first truly transparent communication like that in the financial sector. Why was that transparency framed as an individualist thing?
Because it shifted communication away from the sort of institutional black box towards a direct, almost peer-to-peer acknowledgement of the customer's subjective experience. They explicitly said it was about celebrating the individual and what the individual thinks. It's really the ultimate commercial translation of that philosophical idea. My opinion matters, my experience is valued, and this company has to respond directly to me.
Wow. So we've literally gone from philosophical treatises defining natural liberty to a company selling car insurance based on the idea that you are unique and valued. That really sets the stage for the next phase, hyper-individualism.
Exactly. So if those foundations of individualism were laid centuries back, we really need to ask now what accelerated this trend into what commentators are calling hyper-individualism, this intense, sometimes almost pathological focus inward.
And the consensus across the sources we looked at points overwhelmingly towards, well, the technological and economic structures that have really taken hold over the last couple of decades.
Technology, yeah, particularly social media. It's described in one source as the ultimate breeding ground for narcissistic individualism. I mean, these platforms are fundamentally built on elevating the self, aren't they? The whole architecture of Instagram, TikTok, even LinkedIn, it's centered on this idea that you are the brand.
Right. And success isn't measured by community contribution or collective effort anymore. It's quantified by individual metrics, likes, followers, views. This creates this powerful, relentless push to focus inward, constantly refining and promoting a personal brand that's often completely detached from any real-world community purpose.
Yeah.
The self just becomes the main preoccupation.
And this hyper-focus gets structurally reinforced by the modern economy, too. Think about the rise of the gig economy. Companies like Uber, DoorDash, even Amazon's fulfillment networks. They increasingly classify their workforce not as employees, but as these fragmented collections of independent contractors.
Which legally reinforces that idea of the lone economic agent, right? You're not part of a collective. You're just a service provider in this kind of survival of the fittest marketplace.
Precisely. And that structure undermines things like collective bargaining, union protection, shared benefits. It further cements the philosophical idea that your security, your success, it all relies entirely on your individual effort, completely separate from any institutional or community support.
And this drift, both philosophical and economic, is captured by the commentator Aaron Hosey. He suggests the pendulum between we and I has swung so far towards I that it could hit something like 85% focus inward by 2030. And he thinks this acceleration is largely fueled by AI, which promises to create these increasingly bespoke, hyper-personalized worlds just for the individual.
Yeah, the promise of a perfectly tailored life. It's incredibly appealing. But the cost, as we're definitely seeing now, is pretty significant social and psychological damage.
Indeed. I mean, the U.S. Surgeon General, Dr. Vivek Murthy, actually declared loneliness a public health epidemic back in May 2023. And we're not just talking about older people. The Miami hurricane reported that young adults, like 18 to 24-year-olds, are reporting exceptionally high feelings of isolation, often even though they're constantly connected digitally.
And this loneliness epidemic seems like a direct result of hyper-individualism, because the very tools we use supposedly for connection, social media, are simultaneously driving self-absorption. The issue isn't just lack of physical presence, it's the cultural justification that's grown up around apathy.
Which brings us to that phrase, I don't owe anyone anything. Now, originally, that was a really important boundary-setting mantra, right? Helping people escape toxic or codependent relationships. But it seems to have, well, mutated in this hyper-individualist culture.
Yeah, observers note it's become a kind of justification for a generalized apathy. Not just apathy towards toxic people, but towards basic kindness, community care, even big societal problems like climate change or just basic civic engagement. If your individual brand is everything, why spend your resources on the community?
This is where that line between productive individualism and just plain selfishness gets really, really thin. As some students reported in one survey, this trend leads to a pessimistic view of life and a real lack of empathy. They recognize that true individualism should involve awareness of your place, your contributions, not just self-absorption.
And this social disconnection. We can look at it through the sociological concept of anomie, but in a kind of uniquely modern form.
Right. Durkheim's original idea of anomie was about societal breakdown, wasn't it? Like the rapid loss of clear norms after industrialization, leading to personal confusion, distress. How is liberated anomie different?
So Liberated Anatomy describes a disconnection from society, yes, but crucially, not a disconnection from the self.
Mm.
The individual feels quite centered, quite coherent, but they feel liberated from the moral constraints of society. This state, which was maybe exacerbated by the isolation of the pandemic and the atomization of digital life, lets people act with maximum self-interest to satisfy their personal needs without really considering the collective consequences. They don't feel distressed by the lack of norms. They feel free to choose their own.
That distinction is critical. It's not sadness about lost community. It's an active embrace of self-defined freedom that just bypasses communal obligation altogether. So what happens to collective responsibility when this mentality really takes hold?
Well, it struggles dramatically, and you see the friction very clearly in political discourse. The argument often becomes that focusing on individual fulfillment, that consumerist idea that I deserve this, has to happen at the expense of communal or societal well-being.
And you see this reflected in political rhetoric that champions freedom, often, by trying to drastically reduce the role of government. Freedom gets defined as freedom from societal obligations, freedom from paying for universal health care, freedom from mandatory climate action, freedom from taxes that support collective goods. The argument is basically that these collective things infringe on my lock-in liberty.
And this really highlights the tension over rights. We see arguments in some of the sources suggesting individuals have rights, but the collective doesn't. With some critics even saying that focusing on collective responsibility is the clarion call of nearly every authoritarian state trying to suppress individual freedom for the group.
Yet the counter-argument is just as forceful.
Okay.
Unchecked hyper-individualism, defined only by maximizing personal gain, lets wealth and power concentrate, and that destroys the social trust and fairness you need for a functional society in the first place. You can't really have thriving individuals without a stable collective foundation.
Minogue himself points out a really deep historical paradox here related to the welfare state. He observes that earlier commercial societies, driven by individual ambition but also constrained by necessity and local loyalty, actually showed remarkable social cohesion. Think about the patriotic mobilization during the World Wars.
Right. But the modern welfare state, which was designed to help people, provides these unconditional entitlements. Minogue suggests this is like a grant of status rather than being based on a contract. How does this system, meant to help individuals, actually lead to atomization?
Well, by providing that unconditional status and those entitlements, the state kind of relieves the individual of the need for traditional prudence, thrift, or maybe most critically, robust social association. If the state guarantees your basic survival, you don't need to rely on your family, your church, your neighbors, your local community for mutual aid anymore. And this erosion of necessity, Minogue argues, causes the decay of things like traditional family loyalty and shared community effort.
That's a fascinating, really counterintuitive argument. The very systems designed to support vulnerable individuals might end up atomizing them by making their neighbors and communities less essential for survival. They become dependent on the government, not their peers.
Okay, so now we need to shift gears a bit, from philosophy and sociology to hard psychology. We need to understand if these effects of individualism are the same everywhere. And we have some really distinct data from a cross-cultural study comparing subjective well-being, SWB, and relationship dynamics in Japan and the US.
Right. The idea here is to test whether a value system, individualism, which has been historically adaptive in one culture, mainly the West, keeps that benefit when it's introduced into a completely different cultural context.
And the core finding is starkly different between the two. The study found that an individualistic orientation was negatively related to the number of close friends and led to lower subjective well-being for Japanese college students. So more individualistic meant more isolated and less happy. But, and this is key, this negative correlation was not found for American college students.
Wow, that is a massive finding. It suggests that individualism, when it's detached from its original cultural context, can actually become maladaptive. So why are Americans able to stay happy and keep their friends while being individualistic, but Japanese students can't seem to?
The answer, according to the study, lies in what they call the buffer strategy. This is something Western cultures seem to have developed over centuries of socialization. In European American culture, people are independent, yes, but they're also highly mobile and they're socialized to actively seek out and cultivate new interpersonal relationships.
So Western individualism isn't really about isolation. It's more like selective connection. It's built on personal choice rather than inherited obligation.
Exactly. American individualists have learned and internalized specific interpersonal skills that act as a buffer against the isolating potential of autonomy. These skills include things like engaging in explicit self-disclosure, sharing personal feelings, vulnerabilities to build connections, and actively seeking social support when they're stressed. They also operate with high relational mobility. That's the freedom to choose desirable people to form relationships with and also to drop undesirable ones.
Which gives them agency, right? They can assert their independence, but then immediately go out and rebuild their social world based on shared values or personal choice. They're effectively balancing the I and the we through this active relationship work.
Now, contrast that with the Japanese perspective.
Hmm.
In East Asian cultures, individualism is often seen as basically synonymous with being selfish or lonely or socially disruptive. Whereas in the U.S., it's generally viewed positively,
Yeah.
being unique, independent.
And their traditional relationship structure is fundamentally different too.
That's right. East Asian cultures tend to have relatively low relational mobility. Relationships are often long-term, rule-based, highly interdependent. Think family ties, fixed workplace hierarchies, long-term community associations. These relationships give stability, sure, but they can also be very restricting if you're trying to develop a unique self.
So if a Japanese individual tries to seek independence, which is the core promise of individualism, they almost have to violate those restrictive long-term relationships. They basically have to cut those ties.
And that seems to be the crux of the maladaptation. Pursuing independence means severing existing interdependence. But because Japanese individuals generally aren't socially equipped with those Western buffer strategies, those active skills for building new, high-quality, high-mobility friendships, once the old ties are cut, they become severely isolated. Independence literally equals isolation, leading to lower well-being.
This has huge implications for globalization, doesn't it? Because Western systems, the things like performance metrics, personal achievement goals in schools, hyper-competitive, individually focused workplaces are being imported wholesale into East Asia.
Exactly, and it's creating this psychological gap. You import the individualistic structure for success, but you don't import the underlying cultural values and strategies you need to navigate it socially. And this seems to lead to maladaptive responses. The study even suggests this gap might be linked to rising social issues like hikikomori, that phenomenon of severe social withdrawal, where young Japanese adults just retreat entirely from society, possibly due to the psychological pressure of this cultural mismatch.
The lesson seems undeniable then. Cultural context isn't just a backdrop, it's like the operating system. Values that foster freedom and connection in one culture can actually foster isolation and loneliness in another if the necessary relational tools just aren't there. Okay, so now we need to take this discussion from cultural dynamics to hard economic decisions. The ultimate test of I versus we really comes down to collective action, especially when you throw resource inequality into the mix. Can individual freedom and inequality actually coexist with the need for groups to cooperate? This brings us to a really crucial public goods game experiment, the PGG study.
Yeah, the PGG is an excellent model for these collective action dilemmas. It simulates real-world problems like, say, pollution reduction or managing shared resources, where individual short-term interests clash directly with the long-term collective good.
Okay, let's just break down the structure for everyone listening.
Right. So players are put into groups, usually 4 people, and they're given some tokens. They have to secretly decide how many tokens to put in 2 places. A private account, where they just keep whatever they put in that maximizes their individual profit, or a group account. Usually whatever goes into the group account gets doubled, and then that total is shared equally among all 4 players, regardless of who put what in. The individual temptation, obviously, is to contribute nothing to free ride and just benefit from what others put in.
And this experiment specifically tested how different structures of inequality would affect cooperation. How did they actually structure the treatments to isolate the effect of the distribution itself?
Well, they kept the total amount of resources the same across all groups, and they kept the overall level of inequality consistent using a Gini coefficient of 0.25. But they varied how the resources were distributed among the 4 players. There were 3 conditions. One was the baseline, homogeneous. Everyone started with 100 tokens, 0 inequality. Simple. Then collectivistic inequality. Here, players with high amounts were grouped together. 2 players got 150 each, and players with low amounts were grouped together. 2 got 50 each. This was designed to test the social identity theory idea that maybe these similar subgroups would cooperate better internally. And finally, individualistic inequality. In this one, all 4 players had unique, unequal amounts, 160, 120, 80, and 40 tokens. This really maximized the individual distinction.
Okay, so the standard assumption based on most previous research is that inequality breeds resentment, kills trust, and therefore tanks cooperation. What did the actual results show?
The findings were, frankly, highly counterintuitive. They completely upended that core assumption. Both the collectivistic and the individualistic inequality treatments showed significantly higher average cooperation rates. We're talking around 51% contribution to the public good. Compare that to the homogeneous baseline group, where everyone started equal. They stalled out at only about 35.7% cooperation.
Whoa, okay, wait, that's a huge difference. Inequality didn't just fail to destroy cooperation, it actually seemed to enhance it.
It certainly looks that way from the raw data. And furthermore, the second key finding challenged another core prediction from behavioral economics. There was no significant difference in cooperation rates between the collectivistic group, with its similar subgroups, and the individualistic group, where everyone was unique. This directly contradicts social identity theory, which would predict that similarity within those subgroups should have promoted stronger cooperation. Didn't seem to matter.
Okay, so if the type of inequality didn't matter, but the mere existence of inequality boosted cooperation, we need to figure out the mechanism here. Why did these unequal systems succeed where the equal system kind of faltered?
The analysis really dug into what was mediating this effect. The first critical factor they identified was group identity. Participants who reported feeling a strong sense of group identity showed a really notable, sustained increase in cooperation over the rounds of the game, regardless of how unequal their starting position was. Basically, the strength of the we feeling mattered more than the perceived fairness of the I's starting resources.
Huh. So the inequality itself almost served as a catalyst, like a shared challenge that pushed them to form a stronger group identity, like fighting a common enemy, which in this case was the inequality within the group.
That seems to be part of it, and the strongest predictor for developing that group identity and achieving high cooperation was the ability to reduce the initial inequality early on in the game. This wasn't just about the total amount contributed, but the relative sacrifice, especially from those at the top.
Wait, let's unpack that. That means the high endowment players, the ones starting with 160 tokens, were absolutely essential here.
They really were. They had the capacity, because they started with more, to make disproportionately larger contributions early on. And when they did that, it established them not as exploiters, but as leaders demonstrating commitment to the collective good. These big early contributions effectively served a coordinative function.
Okay, that's the key distinction. In the homogeneous group, where everyone had 100 tokens, the responsibility felt diffuse, right? Anyone could free ride and justify it by thinking, well, someone else will probably contribute.
Exactly. But in the unequal groups, the inequality itself made it much clearer how much everyone should contribute proportionally to try and equalize things or reach the group goal. When the wealthiest player makes a substantial contribution, it sets a very clear example of fairness and commitment. So the inequality, paradoxically, made the collective challenge more visible, more actionable. It allowed those high endowment players to signal commitment and mitigate the potential conflict, which then boosted trust and cooperation among all the members, who then tended to reciprocate.
This completely shifts the focus, doesn't it? Inequality isn't inherently destructive to collective action if the group has the agency, the tools, and crucially, that strong group identity to actively address the distribution early on. It moves us away from just fearing inequality towards demanding mitigation and coordination within the group itself. Hashtag outro.
Wow, okay, so we have journeyed quite a distance today. From the philosophical assertion of the independent self back in the 17th century, through the sociological crisis of hyper-individualism today, and finally landing on this complex experimental data about collective action. We've seen how the Lockean tradition fueled incredible freedom and economic growth, but also how its modern hyperversion has contributed to a declared epidemic of loneliness and apathy, that state of liberated enemy you mentioned.
And we've also found that the success, or lack thereof, of individualism isn't globally uniform at all. That cross-cultural data showing that without those historical buffer strategies, those crucial relational skills individualism can lead to profound isolation, like we see potentially happening in Japanese culture. Culture really, really matters, especially in a globalized system.
And maybe most surprising of all, that public goods game showing that economic inequality doesn't automatically doom cooperation. Instead, inequality, when it's paired with a strong sense of group identity and critically visible efforts towards redistribution or fairness, can actually serve a coordinative function, potentially enhancing the collective good.
So, the balance between the I and the we. It's clearly not a fixed position. It's a dynamic choice we're constantly making, maybe even unconsciously. Our sources suggest that whether it's through crisis or maybe just a quiet yearning for connection, the pendulum might be starting to swing back towards the collective. The critical question then, maybe for you, the listener, is this. How do we actively foster those essential buffers, those relational skills, the mechanisms for early redistribution or signaling fairness, and that necessary group identity. How do we foster those things that let us fully enjoy the benefits of individual freedom without suffering the really severe societal costs of atomization and collective failure?
That's definitely something to think about. If you found these insights into this shifting dynamic between individual autonomy and collective necessity compelling, please do subscribe, like, and maybe comment to share your own thoughts on this important deep dive.
Thank you for listening to The Deep Dive.